Okay, welcome to Juniper Art Gallery's book club for Pride Month, June 2022. And we are very excited to have with us today Doug Bauder. I'm going to read a brief introduction about who our esteemed guest is today, about the author. He has a book that we are studying right now called The Privilege of Being Queer, A Life of Surprises and Gratitude by Doug Bauder. So in December 2019, Doug Bauder retired from Indiana University, serving as director of the IU Bloomington LGBTQ plus Culture Center from 1994 to 2019. Campus administrators appointed him to various committees related to diversity and multicultural issues, and he received numerous awards, including the IU Presidential Medal for Distinguished Service. Before his years in higher education, Doug pastored congregations in urban, small town, and rural settings, worked as a hospital chaplain, volunteered in hospice setting, and assisted people with physical and mental disabilities. Doug received his Bachelor of Arts in Sociology in 1971 from Moravian College and his Master of Divinity in 1975 from Princeton Theological Seminary. Doug currently resides in Bloomington, Indiana, with his husband, Martin Siegel, a retired IU professor of informatics. Their family includes 4 adult children and their spouses. So I am going to come and sit beside Doug, and we're just going to have a conversation, and hope you will enjoy this. We've got several copies of his book, and you can make a donation to Spencer Pride during this month, and you can get a free copy of the book once you've made a donation to Spencer Pride. So Lisa, I'm going to ask that you maybe help with this because I'm not sure. We're going to move a little bit closer so that it can hear us well. Okay. Now let's move up and we'll just have a conversation.
Sure.
Is that good?
So it looks good.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
It's okay. Yeah, don't go away. I want you to stick here with us. And can you make sure that the volume is up too on this? I just want to make sure that volume is picking up all this. Okay. All right. So thank you, Doug, for joining us.
Glad to be here. It's always nice to be called esteemed.
Well, you are in my eyes. After having read your book twice and just being brought to tears a couple times, your life is so interesting to me, so rich and full and so authentic. And that's really kind of the heart, I feel, of what I gained from the book was just reading about how your life began, growing up in the 50s,
Yep.
I era, and then the 60s, the turbulent 60s. And just seems like, and the book is kind of laid out that way by decades, what an interesting trip you were on, from childhood that brings you to this point in your life. So really just want to have a conversation about that.
Sure.
So
Now, let me elaborate a little bit on what you've already said, because I really believe all of us have stories to share. And when we share them in order to benefit others, sort of what we were talking about before we began here, and when we share our stories in order to benefit others, we can really make a difference. So writing this book was all about that. I hope some of the stories are useful to people if they read it. Some people cry, some people laugh.
I laughed too quite a few times.
Well, especially during the foreword when my friend Mike wrote it.
Yes.
The foreword. I'm hoping it made people a little more sensitive, thoughtful, created some understanding, which I think is what the book was really intended to do. I wrote this, as you indicated, right after my retirement, and it was exceedingly therapeutic. I had promised myself on January 2nd, I retired on my last day at IU was December 30th, just before the COVID took over, And I sat down on January 2nd and just started writing. And I had a legal pad, my cup of coffee, and I couldn't stop writing. It was just a wonderful experience. Because I'd never written a book before, but I had the discipline of writing sermons, so that helped. As you indicate, each chapter is a decade of my life. I try to indicate some of the significant moments in a given decade of my life, and then also to reflect on what was going on in the larger world, in the world of arts, education, religion, and politics, specifically as it impacted the gay community, queer community, and realized in time I had the privilege of impacting the culture myself. It was, that's sort of how the book unfolds. And I know 3 lessons I learned, and they were actually things I had known before, but that were affirmed for me in writing the book. One is that the search for one's identity is a lifelong process. Coming out can happen at any time in people's life, and there can be different ways of coming out. So that was one of the things. The second thing was that all of us are privileged in some way, and I really believe that. And lastly, that one person can make a difference. So those were some of the lessons. You mentioned Ike, and I thought I would, as a teaser and as a way of helping people understand what the book is about, I share a couple pages from that first chapter that sort of explains what I'm doing, because again, I'm talking about my little world and then what's happening in the larger American culture. So if I may, I'll read a page or two from the first chapter, which is I Like Ike, which was that's Dwight Eisenhower, president back in the 50s.
I guess that does have to be said.
For anyone, who was born in this decade or in this, exactly. So one of my earliest memories includes an image of me riding my tricycle around the neighborhood. I must have been 5 or 6 years old, and it was probably the summer of the political conventions of that era. And I distinctly remember with pride sporting American flags and I Like Ike stickers affixed to my trike. I don't recall that I was forced to do so. I'm sure I was not. It was something I wanted to do. At some level, I was fascinated, even as a young boy, by things political and how such matters might impact my own life. Growing up in Pennsylvania may also have influenced my early interest in American history and presidential history in particular. I even recall entering into a summer reading program at our local library before 6th grade and reading as many age-appropriate books as I could find on the American presidency. There was nothing to suggest that growing up in the 1950s, I would find my life taking a rather drastic turn in the decades ahead. However, now as I look back, there were moments in time, clues you might say, to a discovery which would eventually lead me in my 30s to come out as gay. And I'm happy to talk about those if you're interested. There's some funny memories and stories, but what I wanted to do then is shift to what I learned about Ike later in time. All of this was happening in my little world, but what was going on in the larger world? It was, in fact, the time of the Cold War. Tensions were mounting between the Soviet Union and the United States for a host of reasons. And in the halls of Congress, that period of history would come to be known as the McCarthy era, when a senator from Wisconsin charged that communists were serving in the United States government. The Red Scare is how it was termed, and the American people were led to believe that communism was one of the greatest evils that was encroaching on our way of life. Related to those fears was something called the Lavender Scare, the knowledge that people who identified as homosexual were also serving in the government. And because they were living a secret life, they could be blackmailed and were a considerable security risk. Consider the fact that the year before I was born, in 1948, noted sexologist Alfred Kinsey had written his groundbreaking book entitled Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, in which the varied sexual behaviors of men were recounted in great detail. Kinsey would publish his research on women 5 years later. The Kinsey report amazed Americans with the knowledge that 30% of adult American males among his subjects had engaged in some sort of homosexual activity. and that perhaps 10% of any given population could be exclusively homosexual. In the opinion of many, Kinsey's research had a significant role in the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. While Kinsey's work may have given comfort to people who identified as gay, a Pandora's box which he opened no doubt fueled the fears of others, including those in the government who claimed that closeted homosexuals would pose a considerable security risk, leading to the probability of being blackmailed by our nation's enemies. And there were indeed individuals in the government who identified as homosexual. There is a legendary story that comes out of World War II, told by Women's Army Corps soldier Nell Johnny Phelps, who claimed to have been given orders by then General Dwight Eisenhower to ferret out the lesbians in her WAC detachment. Phelps served in the South Pacific, working as a medic, and later, after reenlisting, was sent to Germany as part of the post-World War II occupation forces. In 1947, according to an interview with Phelps, she was told by Eisenhower, "It's come to my attention that there are lesbians in the WACs. We need to ferret them out." Phelps is said to have replied, "If the general please, sir, I'll be happy to do that, but the first name on the list will be mine." Eisenhower's secretary, who overheard the conversation, then added, "If the general please, sir, my name will be first, and hers will be second." Phelps went on to report, "Sir, you are right. There are lesbians in the WACs. And if you want to replace all the clerks, section commanders, drivers, every woman in the WAC detachment, I'll be happy to make that list. But you must know, sir, that they are the most decorated group. There have been no illegal pregnancies, no AWOLs, no charges of misconduct." Eisenhower, it is said, dropped the idea. Some say this story is mythical. Whatever the case, homosexuality was very much on the minds of military leaders and government officials during this time. And by the time Eisenhower was elected president, he sadly issued Executive Order 10450, which prohibited the federal government from hiring gay and lesbians, and in fact, fired anyone suspected of being lesbian or gay. Estimates suggest that this decision impacted thousands of people. Ironically, Eisenhower's national security advisor, Robert Butler, oversaw that executive order, and later in life, it was revealed that he himself was gay.
Wow.
So this is sort of what I do with the book. I talk about, even as a little kid, I sort of admired this man from a distance as much as I could. And then I learned later in life, as we often do, wow, he maybe wasn't the most wonderful man that I thought he would be. And so each chapter goes through what, again, as I said, was significant in my life, what was happening in the larger world. And finally, I don't know, by the 1980s and 90s, I realized I need to address this issue, both from a personal standpoint and ultimately from a professional standpoint.
Yeah. So speaking of like professionalism and all the different hats you've worn over the years, I think that was a really interesting part of the book as well. You speak about being very much involved in the church, your family, and as a young person, and taking that path and going to school to study religion. And if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that part of your life where you were
Sure.
deciding that would be interesting.
Well, I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and the church that is very strong there is called the Moravian Church. It's very much a middle-of-the-road Protestant church. People know a little bit about the Lutherans, and the Moravians came around 70 years before Luther. A guy named John Huss was calling for reforms in the church. Moravians are considered one of the first of the Protestant churches, so they were protesting what the Catholic Church or the Roman Church at that time was calling people to do. Among the things that the church was requiring of people was that they would have to pay for their, depending on what their sins were, they would have to pay for some indulgences. They would get forgiven if they paid so much money to
Interesting.
it's just one of the church, and a guy named John Huss who was the leader of the Moravian Church, said, "That's not right. That's not biblical." And he was burned at the stake for his heresy. Luther, about 70 years later, called for similar reforms in the church. He was just excommunicated. So in that background, that was a denomination that then ended up coming to the States, and there's only one Moravian church in Indiana, in a little town called Hope, not far from here.
I know where Hope is.
But Bethlehem in Pennsylvania and Winston-Salem in North Carolina are sort of centers of the church. The church has emphasized the value of education, thinking through one's faith, does not interpret scripture literally, but gives people a certain amount of freedom. So education is important, and music is very important to Moravians. So little gay boy who didn't know he was gay grew up in that environment and found it very nurturing. And
yeah, I was kind of impressed with, I wasn't familiar with that church, and
but many people are not.
And to hear about their emphasis on education and questioning as part of
The
their
process.
teachings and the process. And I thought, well, that's a really good way of approaching
It's very
spirituality.
healthy. It's very healthy. When it came to dealing with homosexuality, the church wasn't quite sure what to do.
But we're still talking the 50s, 60s, right?
Right. Well, yeah. Again, I was growing up in the 50s. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that our denomination actually affirmed gay and lesbian pastors. So we're kind of late in the game. And that was 25 years after I came out. And there's a lot of time in between there. But I remember the day that decision was made by the denomination. Friends of mine who are now in leadership positions in the church, some who are closeted lesbians and gay people, called me to say that my witness to the church, because I've stayed connected even though it's been sort of on the edge, my witness had made a difference. And that felt good, that somehow or other living my truth has helped the church move into the 21st century.
Yeah.
So anyway.
One of the things that I was reading in the book that I thought was interesting, and we're kind of jumping back and forth here, but before you graduated from Princeton, you wrote a 16-page treatise citing theologians commenting on homosexuality, and you revealed for the first time your own struggle.
Right.
And I thought that was a really interesting read, that part of the book. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, because you've even evolved way beyond what you wrote at that point. But it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's bold.
Well, I felt like I needed to come to terms with this because I had met a beautiful woman who I was planning to marry. This was my senior year in seminary, and it was a practical theology class. And this was one of the topics we were given to write about. And I did a lot of reading and was listening to theologians of the day. I found the paper as I started writing this. I thought, I think I still have that paper somewhere. And sure enough, it was in a folder out in a box in the garage. And I read through it and I thought, oh my gosh, I've evolved a little bit since then. But it was, there was some level of acceptance, or at least I was calling for dialogue, saying the church needed to come to terms with this issue. There were people who were gay in the church. I knew that, even though I wasn't quite sure I was gay. I hadn't really identified myself, but I had read enough stories and knew enough other people that I thought this is an issue that it's about honesty and being authentic. And so I wrote about that and felt I was safe in coming out, sort of, to my, I guess it was a New Testament professor. I got an A on that paper. So.
I bet you did.
Well, he thought I had thought through things pretty clearly, but I think he understood I was struggling with this at the time at a very personal level. So, and I told my former wife, my late former wife, Joan's no longer living, before we were married, I spoke to her about my fears and my fantasies. That's how I described them, because I was still a virgin. I had not had a sexual relationship with any women, but really hadn't had any sexual relationship with men either. I just knew that I was drawn to men, images of men and stories about men. I would go to a porn theater in Philadelphia where I was doing an internship in a church and watch some porn movies, and I knew there was some interest in at some level. So I was trying to come to terms with this, but had no idea how to do it.
And it sounds like you were also being honest that you were having struggles before you even married.
Well, I was with Joan. She's the
Yes.
only, other than my New Testament professor, Joan knew, but we made love before we were married and assumed everything was working,
Yeah.
the plumbing was working, and we loved each other. And she was a nurse and didn't know much about homosexuality herself, nor did I, from a clinical standpoint. And psychologists at that day were still saying, you find, for men, you find the right woman and this will all go away.
Right.
That was one of the thoughts.
Because it was something.
It was a
that
latent stage of
you were-
development.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So.
I wanted so badly to believe that.
Yeah, I think a lot of men and women from that era
Yes.
wanted very badly to
Right.
believe that.
Right.
Yeah, and yet it doesn't work that way.
It didn't for me.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me that you wrote that 16-page treatise over 40 years ago.
Yeah, well, again, it was-
Wow.
It was some way of trying to come to terms with this.
Yeah, and it says 40 years before the 2014 rights to ordination in the Moravian Church, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you maintained a connection with them all these years, even though there had to be some fallout there a little bit,
Yeah.
You named two heroes in your life in the book. One was Troy Perry, as from a religious standpoint, and then the other was Harvey Milk from
Yeah.
a political standpoint. Do you want to say anything about them?
Well,
Since they're
it was-
heroes.
Yeah, it was just interesting in rereading Troy Perry's journey. It was not unlike my own, except when he came out to a leader of his church, his bishop told him to go and sin no more. Basically, I mean, you got to get this together and forget that you're gay. I mean, it was not a very helpful response. Whereas my bishop said, Doug, I've known this about you. This was after the divorce. He understood what the issue was, and he said, and I was hoping you could help the church come to terms with this issue. He was so kind. He was so accepting. But what he said blew me away and made me think, no way, buddy. I'm not ready to be the poster boy for gay issues in our church. But that's exactly what happened. I mean, he was a prophet in many regards and became a dear friend as the years went on. And I lived out that prophecy, as it were. So from a religious standpoint, he gave me the courage to say there's a place for me in the church. Harvey Milk was a hero from a political standpoint. And
For a lot of people.
oh, yeah. And, not long ago, I watched again the movie Milk
Sean Penn.
with Sean Penn. And Milk's story is fascinating. He was a character, and a brave character, who was assassinated in San Francisco. One of the things younger people who've read my book, former students, have said, I knew nothing of our history. And what I wanted to say is, get to know your history. I'm just touching on some of the historical moments in my life. That was one. But there are heroes and heroines out there, some of who I met along the way, and I didn't meet Milk, but I really admired him. So we have a history. Yeah.
So I don't think we can really talk about your life without going into the 80s and kind of your dark night of the soul time period, because
Dark Night of the Soul.
it really is a big decision for someone to make a statement such as such as you did, to come out and to have your marriage end, and then to have to make so many adjustments at that point. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you describe it as being really painful.
It was.
You know, you had a wife and you had 2 children, and she had 3 children, so 5 children involved, and that has to have been a big.
It was an adjustment. I basically took time off from pastoral ministry, so I wasn't getting much of an income. I worked security for a while.
Yeah, I read that.
Tried to pay, some child support when I knew that divorce was inevitable. Joan just didn't feel, we could deal with this. We had some marriage counseling, but that wasn't working, and I realized I was not being true to myself. And so even though it was painful, we separated. And I had one wonderful therapist. I had one who wasn't very good, who wasn't very affirming, but one who was, and helped me find my way. And it worked with Joan and I. And in time, Joan and I became friends again. And I had a number of experiences. I got back involved in the church and was serving a little parish in southern Wisconsin, and had enough experiences there that 5 years into my ministry there, I pretty much came out to them. And the story I like to tell is that soon after doing this, one of the families in the congregation, the wife of one of the husbands who was on the board, well, I had said I'd like to take time off. I was going to write a book then about being gay and being Christian. The church, the Moravian Church, was talking about a search for wholeness in terms of this issue. And that's what the title of the book was going to be. And I asked the board of the church I was serving, which is a part-time position, if I could take a month sabbatical to work with a liberal theologian in Minnesota to write this book, and they granted that. And so I lost my train of thought. So I was going to write this book. Oh, and I had asked the board for permission, and I told them it was not just for a professional reason; it was a personal reason. And there was silence in the room. I said, "I'm telling you that I'm gay." And the first response from one of the board members, and this is a small rural congregation, was a woman sitting to my right. I can still picture her. She said, "Doug, has this been hard for you to tell us?" And I thought, what a wonderful response. Yes.
Yes.
But then we laughed, because then they understood why I wasn't dating any of their daughters, in the congregation. Yeah. We actually had a laugh about that.
Yeah, I almost have to think that sometimes people probably have a pretty good idea before.
Well, they didn't.
They didn't. You don't think so at all?
No, well, they didn't. But what happened soon after that, in fact, it was like a week after that confession, that I was visiting in the farmhouse of a couple. The man had been on the board, or was on the board, and his wife was having a mastectomy, and I went to have prayer and conversation with her. And at some point in the conversation, they both started crying, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. And Dolores said, "Doug, we've never told anyone this, but their son had gotten some girl pregnant 30 years before. And they never told anyone. Certainly none of the previous pastors knew this. And they wondered if it was appropriate for them to love the granddaughter born out of wedlock as much as the children who were born after they were married." And that was my response. I couldn't believe they were asking that, or that they had struggled so hard with this for all these years, 30 years.
Wow.
I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time.
Right.
But what Dolores said is, "We could not have told you that if you hadn't shared your journey with me." And that was a real God moment for me, a real moment of saying, I need to be more authentic. I need to be honest. There are people out there hurting with all sorts of issues that I can speak to. I don't know even what I said to them, but I tried to give a graceful response, and then walked out of the farmhouse thinking, oh my gosh, the church has just screwed so many people up.
Wow.
So that
Yeah.
was a really, really important moment for me.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I stayed on at that church for another 5 years.
Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. Do you need to take a quick break?
No, I'm okay.
You're doing good?
I'm
okay,
fine.
Great. Well, I wanted to talk about how you ended up meeting your husband.
Yeah.
After, I know you were basically, you came out as gay, but you weren't necessarily dating a lot of men or anything at that point, correct?
Yeah. I don't remember that chapter.
It seems like you said, there was a length of time that your kids were comfortable with you because you weren't actually bringing a man home with
Right. Well, basically, the kids were with me every other weekend,
you. Uh-huh.
and on the other weekends, I was dating,
Okay.
or at least I was pursuing relationships,
Right.
because I was living near Madison, Wisconsin. And I was
Very
going,
liberal town, right?
absolutely, and I was going to various groups. I would stop in at the bars. I was looking for someone,
Mm-hmm.
and as it turns out, I met Marty online well before online dating existed.
Oh,
There was something called, I can't remember
it's
if
like a chat room or something?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, but it was called phone sex.
Oh.
Yes,
I don't think you
I
wrote
mentioned-
that in the book.
Okay, so this is news, folks.
Revealed.
Yeah, so it was before the days of chat rooms, and
Uh-huh.
we, would play around with each other online, and at one point, I was just feeling I need to be honest. And I said, Marty, can I be honest with you? This is who I really am. Not this role that I'm playing, which I think was pretty common in those days, in the 80s, I believe it was. And he apparently liked my honesty, and we met soon after that.
Mhm.
He had just moved to Bloomington, but we met in Chicago where he grew up, and I liked him immediately. And we developed a long distance relationship, and for a year, he would come up on those weekends when the kids weren't there.
Mhm.
And finally, I introduced them,
Mhm.
and my daughter reminds me it was not a good time.
Mhm.
It was her 16th birthday, and she did not want to meet Marty.
Uh,
They love each other now.
Right.
So much has happened, but that too was a risk, because I was afraid I'd lose their love and support. And I
Right.
love my kids. I know that my coming out has benefited them in so many ways. One's an educator, the other's a social worker, and this is just one of the causes that they care about. So we maintained a really close relationship over the years. My ability to be honest with them,
Mhm.
I think, made our relationship, dad and son and dad and daughter, pretty remarkable, even though initially they weren't sure what to do
Right.
with this.
Right.
I think one of the appendixes in the book is a conversation with a counselor.
It is, yeah. That was really interesting.
Yeah, and we
too.
talk about how they came to terms with things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting part of your story too, is that coming out actually in many ways improved your relationship
Absolutely.
with your children. And I think so many people might fear the opposite. And I just think honesty is so important.
Absolutely.
Your children want you to be authentic. They want you to be who you are, and know you as who you really are.
For a number of years, Courtney, my son, taught courses on multiculturalism. He still is teaching them, but he always had a class on queer issues or gay issues. And he would invite me up to speak to the class, but he wouldn't introduce me as his father initially. He said, we have a special guest today, and he'd go on and on about my work at Indiana University. And then he'd say, oh, and for the fact you don't know, he's my father. And everyone in the class would go, what? And we called it Gay Father, Straight Son. And it was great because the kids got to ask, his students got to ask what it was like for him to grow up with a gay dad.
Yeah.
And he didn't grow up in my house. He just spent weekends with. But it was, again, an opportunity to be honest. And often kids in that class would come out or identify. Some of them had gay parents, lesbian parents, or friends. So it opened the door, created understanding. And that's that's been, I think, my calling, as it were, since day one.
So I want to talk about IU and how you came about having the position you held, which was a really important position in my opinion. But also, just sticking with your children for one more minute, I think it was in the appendix where your daughter was talking about how hard it was. Like she didn't want to be identified as an other as a teenager,
Right.
and she was afraid if people knew her father was gay, then she would automatically be in a different category than all the other kids.
Yeah.
And I think it's that part of the book was really honest, them saying about their struggle, trying to come to terms with it, but then how you eventually worked through it. They grew up, they saw the benefits, and as they grew, they embraced it completely and have embraced Marty completely as
Right.
well.
And Marty has two children similar in age to mine, and
Were they going through the same
not exactly.
issues? No?
Adam's a little bit older, and he actually came to IU, and he was pretty supportive. But again, he was a little bit older. Mara, a little younger than my two, so my two are in the middle. Anyway, they've become a wonderful, we're a great family, and when we all get
Sounds
together,
like it.
we're going to get together for Father's Day, and it's always fun to have the whole crew together.
Yeah, and 10 grandchildren, is that
4
right?
kids, 10 grandchildren.
Wow,
Yeah.
congratulations, that's awesome.
Yeah. So
So anyway, you and Marty had a long distance relationship.
for a year,
for
and
a
Marty
year,
said, "I can't keep doing this, Doug. We need to."
7-hour drive, I get it.
Yeah.
One way.
So I was ready to make a change in my life, and I said, "I'll come to Bloomington."
Mhm.
Biggest risk of my life, and I had some experience as a hospital chaplain, so I thought I might either do that or hospice work or something. And I looked around, and as I was searching for a job, I was working at Stone Belt, which is a facility that cares for people with mental and physical disabilities. And this position at IU was opening. They wanted a coordinator for their, at that point, GLB office.
Mhm. I remember when that was
I
a
applied
thing.
for it,
Yes.
and I was one of 3 candidates. Well, I think there were close to 100 people who applied for it, but I was among the top 3. And I asked the dean of students, the man who was dean of students when I was hired, I said, Dick, on the last day of his position before he retired, I said, Dick, I had a question I wanted to ask you. I've always wanted to ask you, was I hired in part to deal with the religious crazies? And he said, well, not entirely, but it helped a lot that you had a pastoral background, because that seemed to all of us to be an advantage. Many of the state legislators were using religion as a whipping boy, or as a, when the office opened, there was so much controversy, and I'm sort of a conciliator, and I'm a bridge builder, and they saw the value of that in me. So,
and all that experience as a pastor,
well,
and I can see that's.
Even though it's a state university, they saw value in that, so I was hired.
Yeah, well, and good for IU, and good for all the people that have gone through that center.
It's been a remarkable experience.
Yes, and I'd like to hear just maybe some stories from the center that are outstanding to you.
Wow.
There just have to be so many, 25 years,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I think of the gentleman who came back for our 25th anniversary and spoke. I wanted a student to be a speaker. His name is Shane Windmeyer, and he organized or established an organization called Campus Pride that surveys universities and colleges all over the nation, so that if you're queer and you're interested in Temple University and you want to know what their policies are and what sort of resources they have for gay, lesbian, bi, trans kids, you can look online and it's there. He does this extensive survey of schools all over the nation and then rates them with 5 stars or whatever. He's done incredible work because he did some internship in our office.
Oh, wow.
And so that's something we're very, very proud of. I think of a gentleman who came in the office a year or so before I retired, and he had just celebrated his wedding with his partner of a number of years. As he was talking, I said, "Did your parents come to that?" Because he had been in the office some years before, saying that his parents had disowned him. And we were able to get a scholarship for him so he could stay in school, because they cut him off financially. And we had established a scholarship program with IU alum, and he stayed in school, was now a successful businessman. And I said, "Did your parents come to your wedding?" He said, "Yeah, it took a couple of years for them to come to terms, but I think they decided a relationship with me was worth it."
Oh.
And that was the nice thing, as some students were struggling, but I would hear from them later on that some changes had been made. Now, that didn't happen in all cases.
Yeah.
Because they were always arguing. But my mom's now dating a woman, and I don't get it. And I was
Well, he
able,
came to the right place.
well, I was able to speak to him as a parent as well as a gay man. And I said, give yourself some time, ask your questions, don't be afraid to talk to your parents. This is a unique time in your life. So, and I got to speak to parents as well. And I don't know, those are just a couple stories. I'm trying to think of.
Well, just the one you just told, that's so neat, because it sounds like you created a really safe place for somebody that came in and said, "I just don't get it."
Yeah.
They obviously felt welcomed enough to walk in the door and say that.
I should say that I didn't always get it either. And when trans issues became more prevalent or more, we added the T to the office.
Mhm.
I had to talk and understand. I had to just listen.
Mhm.
I'm not an expert on trans issues. I'm not an expert on lesbian issues, but gay and lesbian issues were a little more familiar to me. And I did not understand trans or intersex or polyamory or all the letters of the alphabet that, have cropped up in more recent years. We have opened a Pandora's box, but there are such a variety of ways of living one's life today, and we're needing to be honest about that. So I have learned a lot.
Well, and I think you making that statement is a good thing for people to hear.
Well,
Given.
yeah, I'm a 72-year-old guy. It took me a long time to come out, so it's also taken me a long time to. And today I hear about things and I shake my head and think, well, I'm glad I'm not in that office anymore. It's too much hard work, because it's one issue after another.
Definitely.
But seriously, it was a learning experience all along the way, and that was part of the joy of the office.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely grew and changed over the years. You said, I just want to go back to some things. I know that, it's just so strange right now with all the, I don't want to get too much into politics, but
Let's do.
it looks like things are going backwards
Yeah.
to me. And you mentioned that you would officiate marriages years ago that were not legally binding,
Right.
which to me was so sad
Yeah.
and so wrong, in my opinion, that they were not legally binding. And then I can remember just being elated. One of the happiest days of my life was when the law passed that gay and lesbian and people could marry whoever they wanted to, and it was okay. And so that was just such a liberating thing. And, I'm really nervous about what's going to happen next. And I just, maybe your take on going from all the oppression to actually gaining a lot of ground to now, like where are we going now? Just curious.
I don't think the Supreme Court knows what they're up against if they reverse this any more than Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
There will be a huge backlash, and I need to say a word about our allies, because the majority of people at Marty's and my wedding were straight friends, and all of our kids who are straight. And, there are many more allies out there than there are gay are queer identified people.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think coming out has created a lot of understanding. I think that's what I felt was so important about telling my story. And not all those people are politically active, but I think they'll become
Mhm.
active as we've seen evidence with the Roe versus Wade controversy going on right now. So, but yeah, it seems like we're going backwards.
Yeah, I have that fear and feeling myself,
Yeah.
you know.
I'm the eternal optimist, so
Good. Somebody has to be, right?
I'm not going to stop fighting.
Good. Yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
I mean, you just can't. But you know what you're saying about all the allies probably going to rise up as well. I'm just thinking about Spencer Pride, and I think probably the majority of volunteers they have there, I think, are allies. You know,
That's my
the straight
impression.
people that live in Spencer,
Right,
you know, who care, and you know, I mean, not all of the volunteers, but I think a lot of them
Right.
are, and I think that's true across the board. I mean, I'm an ally, and you know, my daughter was one of the kids that started the PFLAG organization at Bloomington North High School. So it's like it's just an important. It's just a, you know, a civil rights issue. You know, it's just like people are people.
Yeah.
They don't need to be discriminated
a
against.
few days after the Orlando shooting, which is now,
Oh.
I don't know how many years ago, Bloomington had a candlelight vigil.
I was at that. Yeah,
You
spoke.
were?
Yeah, you spoke.
I did. And, you know, I looked out at that crowd, and obviously I recognized a number of queer friends, people who I got to know over the years, but I also recognized a huge number of allies. And you can say, oh, yeah, well, that's Bloomington. Well, it's not just Bloomington,
Mhm.
you know. Yeah, that was
A huge crowd.
yeah, there were probably 1,300
Yeah.
people there on a summer's night when it had just stormed and people came out.
Yeah, and for people who might not know what we're referring to, that was the Pulse nightclub.
Right.
Where there's 49, 50 people
Yep.
murdered. Yeah.
49, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a nightclub where, you know, GLBT nightclub, people
Right.
dancing and having a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was one of
I
the.
forget that we need to identify some of these.
Yeah, sometimes we do, because some people might not remember. There's been so many,
Yeah,
sadly.
that too.
Yeah, so I think we're kind of wrapping up here on an hour. So I there were so many things I wanted to talk about, but you know, we've got an hour, so maybe we can do this again sometime. And I wonder if there's anything you would like to say that we didn't have, that I didn't ask or we didn't cover real quick.
I'm actually getting ready for another kind of presentation. And the point I was sort of thinking through my thoughts for that, and I think it applies today, is that, you know, what I think as human beings we need to do is to tell our own stories, whatever the issue is about, and to find and create spaces so other people can tell theirs.
Mm-hmm.
I think when, you know, it doesn't matter what the issue is, but if we can listen to other people's stories, we learn a lot. And that's when minds are open, hearts are changed, legislation maybe can be enacted. But it's really important just to create those spaces where that kind of sharing can happen. Stories matter.
I agree.
That's sort of it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. And June is not only Pride Month, but it's also Father's Day next weekend. So happy Father's
Thank you.
Day.
We will all be together and have a recurring fun Father's Day.
Great, great. Well,
Thanks
thank
a
you
lot.
so much, Doug. It's been really wonderful to have you here. And please do come by Juniper Art Gallery, and you can make a donation to Spencer Pride this month, and you'll get a free copy of Doug's book. Once again, I will show you. It is The Privilege of Being Queer, A Life of Surprises and Gratitude by Doug Bauder, our esteemed guest. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
All right.
I'm sad that no one came in the door while we were here.
Oh,
Is it always? It's not always